All stand, please. All persons having anything to do with the sitting of the Supreme Court of Tasmania draw nigh and give your attendance. Please be seated.
Alan Michael Prestage and others against Melissa Jane Barrett.
Please the Court, my name is Armstrong, initials LWL. I appear with Mr Cox, initials TD, for the plaintiffs in each of the three proceedings. We are instructed by Hall and Wilcox solicitors.
Thank you, Mr Armstrong.
If the Court please, I appear for the first named defendant was my learned friend, Mr Brewer.
Yes, thanks, Mr Reid. Mr Gunson.
I have a cameo appearance, Your Honour, that I appear for RACT Insurance Proprietary Limited in relation to the return of a subpoena.
Thank you. Yes. Mr Armstrong.
Thank you, Your Honour. If it's convenient to the Court and my learned friend, Mr Gunson, perhaps Your Honour might deal with the subpoena first. I formally call on it and seek leave to uplift, inspect and copy the documents that are referred to in it.
Yes, thank you. Mr Gunson. Or is it convenient to you, Mr Reid?
Yeah, I certainly can.
Yes, thank you. Mr Gunson.
If Your Honour please, the documents being produced electronically in redacted form in relation to privilege and the like, there is a covering letter that's been provided to the registrar that sets out the searches that have been undertaken by RACT and its document management system, which essentially says that whilst they're quite confident that it is a complete search, it is not necessarily so because of the affliction of time. On that basis, there is no objection to inspection. It might be convenient if the parties inspect the redacted documents that have been produced, and if there's a debate over the redactions or there's claims of privilege that have been made, then we can have that at a time that's convenient to Your Honour.
Yes, thank you. And you might wish to be heard on that?
Yes.
Yes. And what are your movements during the course of the next few days?
I'm generally around.
Yes. Okay, so if it became necessary, we could liaise with your chambers.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yes, thank you.
And with that, most of Your Honour's leave.
Yes, thanks, Mr Gunson. Mr Armstrong.
I'm generally around for the next few days as well.
Well, I imagine so. Yeah.
Now, please the Court. Your Honour will be well familiar with the Fawcett area east of Hobart between Sorell and Copping. Your Honour can no doubt picture the drive. As one heads down the Arthur Highway, there is the gently undulating farmland that runs down toward Lewisham and Dodgers Ferry and across to Frederick Henry Bay. But Your Honour will also recall that looming above you, to the left of the highway, is a long range of heavily forested country. The terrain along that range would be described as rugged. The hills run into each other, there are steep slopes with low saddles, and they're cut through by creeks and gullies. The soil is poor. Above the gullies on the hills proper, the topsoil is thin and rocky, sitting above hard clays, and the bush is thick. Botanically, it would be described as dry sclerophyll forest, eucalypts and banksia, with an understory of dense bracken and brush. And the climate, of course, is typical of southeastern Tasmania. The forest dries out in summer. And like the rest of the southeast, weather conditions in the hills can change markedly within short periods. Again, at least in summer. That is, there will be cold days and rainy days, followed by hot, dry and windy days, the different types of conditions following each other in their turn. That is, of course, the nature of summer in southeastern Tasmania, as it is across all of southeastern Australia. And like the rest of southeastern Australia, Tasmania's own southeast is at constant risk of bushfires in the dry months of each year. This is notorious. It's common knowledge and it's common sense. And it is reflected in the law of this state. There is each year a fire permit period declared under legislation, the Fire Services Act, that Your Honour will hear more about in due course. During the fire permit period, there are close restrictions as to when and where private citizens may light fires, whether for burning off rubbish, for cooking, or just for the simple enjoyment of a campfire. In December 2012, there was a declared fire permit period in place. It was gazetted and it had been widely published, including in the Mercury. At this point, can I ask the court operator to bring up the first of the documents that we'll ask Your Honour to look at on the court screen. It is document 70 in the bundle, doc.001.001.0002.
28 December wasn't a total fire ban day, though, was it?
Not a total fire ban day, Your Honour, but within the fire permit period.
Yes.
So document 70. There are always teething troubles with an electronic court book in its first outing, Your Honour. I'll let Your Honour know that that's one of my instructors, Mr Temponi.
Yes, thank you. I gathered that.
Paul and Wilcox. He's our resident IT guru.
Yes, that's better.
Now, document 70 was the one I asked for. Thank you. And Your Honour sees in the top left-hand side of the court screen and on the top right-hand side of the actual image the document ID numbers that we'll be referring to over the course of the trial.
Yes, so they're the unique Bates numbers.
The Bates numbers, yes, thank you, Your Honour. Now, if the operator could please scroll down to the bottom left-hand corner of the page, there we go, and perhaps zoom out just a little bit. Your Honour will see perhaps try view. Perhaps at least just scroll up for the moment. Your Honour sees there the declaration of the fire permit period covering the period starting on 28 November 2012, and we understand there's no dispute, Your Honour, that it continued past the 28th of December 2012. Now, Your Honour, the declaration of a fire permit period, and indeed the fact that it was summer, does not imply that every single day was hot and dry. Like any summer, it had its cool days and, of course, quite unsurprisingly, some wet days. So it happened that the evening of the 28th of December was a cool one. The nearest weather station is at Hobart Airport, back across the causeway, and, of course, down below the hills on the coastal plains. The weather records, and I'm hoping these come up, are document 72, doc.001.001.0003, and Your Honour sees on the first page of this document the letter from the Bureau of Meteorology certifying the attached...
I think 150 probably takes you there. No, that is zoom percentage.
Yeah.
You're on 75. 150 is better for everyone, I think.
There we go. Can Your Honour read that okay?
Yes, fine, thank you.
And then if we could scroll down, Your Honour sees there's the letter and then the certification from the officer of the Bureau of Meteorology.
Yes.
And if we could scroll further down to, and sorry, just pause there. Could we turn that screen side on? Thank you.
And you could minimise the sidebar or just drag it away. On the right-hand side, we're just halfway down where there's a little click on that. That's it.
Thank you, Your Honour. I suspect Your Honour has done this before. So Your Honour sees that weather conditions on the 28th of December, maximum of 22.1 degrees Celsius, minimum at about almost halfway across the page of 12.7, and mild winds at around 48 kilometres per hour and gusting generally from the northwest. Now, if anything, Your Honour, that day it was a little cooler up in the hills behind Fawcett. As Your Honour will have seen from the pleadings, the defendant, Ms Barrett, was hosting her partner, Mr Robinson, and his young son for the evening. In the chill of the evening, they decided to have a campfire, just for warmth and for the simple enjoyment of having a campfire. Now, Ms Barrett had only owned her property for about 3 years at that time. It was a bush block with a small house sitting at the highest point on something that might be called a ridge. The house looked out across a small valley or basin which had been cleared in the middle to form a paddock where Ms Barrett kept her horse. Could I ask the operator please to bring up document 101, which is a bundle of photographs, and could we first go to photograph 58? And what Your Honour sees here is an aerial photograph of Ms Barrett's property, or the residence I should say.
Where's north?
The photograph is looking towards the southeast. So north is just to the...
The bottom of the photograph, bottom right-hand corner.
Yes, Your Honour. Sorry, probably towards the left, I think.
The left?
Yes. And grateful to my learned friend, Your Honour, it's agreed that the house looks to the north. So that probably helps Your Honour get...
And we're looking at the back of the house.
No, we're looking at the front.
We're looking at the
house.
front. So that's the front veranda and it faces or looks north.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And if I could ask the operator please next to bring up photograph 0063, the next one. So Your Honour can see this is now taken from the west looking towards the east. And Your Honour can see more of the horse enclosure area to the north of the house, that is in front of the house, near the down from the trampoline. And if we could zoom back a little bit by going to, no, not in that sense, could we go to photograph 0065? And so Your Honour now has his bearings. You can see more of Ms Barrett's property again. The house, as we know, looks to the north, but then what Your Honour sees across towards the top of the photograph is the property at 244 White Hills Road, and Your Honour will hear more about that property in due course. It's pretty much due east of Ms Barrett's residence, and it's further up a hill. Now, what Your Honour can see in the bottom right-hand corner of this photograph, it's hard to tell from the way that the image is presented, but the land drops down into what was quite a thickly forested gully. Your Honour will hear that Ms Barrett was very conscious of the bushfire risks that came with living in such an area. By herself and sometimes with Mr Robinson, she had done a lot of work to clear vegetation from the area around her residence and also generally cleaning up the block. She knew there was a fire permit period declared in about October of each year, and so when she was burning off the cleared vegetation debris, she did it in the autumn and winter months. There were various locations around the property where she and Mr Robinson would burn off the piles of branches and other debris that they'd cleaned up. But Your Honour will hear evidence that the main spot where they undertook the larger of their burning off bonfires was up near the house. If we could go back please to photograph 0058. What Your Honour sees towards the left of the house in the photograph is a dark black spot with some pink lines around it. The pink lines are very faint. They
Oh yes, I can see them. Yes. Okay.
That black spot, Your Honour, was an old tree stump. Ms Barrett and Mr Robinson would pile their burning off bonfires over that stump and burn it off from time to time, in part to burn out the tree stump, which was an eyesore. There's a closer up photograph of the stump as at photo 0004 in document 101.
So is this the tree stump?
This is the tree stump, Your Honour. And Your Honour sees now that there's the pink police tape and also pink chalk or spray paint markings on the ground about halfway up the photograph as we're looking at it. And Your Honour will recall from the previous photograph that again we are effectively looking towards the east, towards 244 White Hills Road. Now the stump was some 20 to 30 metres east of the residence. It had once been a large tree. Your Honour can perhaps tell from the photograph that what was left was still more than a metre across. Now little, if anything, turns on the question of what species of tree it was, but the evidence suggests it was a eucalypt and probably a silver peppermint, since that is the dominant species in the immediate area. Now, the winter burn-offs that Ms Barrett and sometimes Mr Robinson had undertaken had burned the stump down virtually to ground level by December 2012. What remained was largely a rim of wood at about ground level, but with some of the jagged pieces still sticking up that Your Honour sees in the photograph. And inside that wooden rim, the burn-offs had left a slight depression. Now Your Honour will hear that, as well as occasionally lighting the bonfires for burning off purposes on the tree stump, Ms Barrett and Mr Robinson had lit campfires at other places around the property in the past.
Just before you leave the tree stump, will the evidence show over how many years there were fires built in and burned in that tree stump?
Ms Barrett will only be able to speak to the period since she'd owned the property, Your Honour.
Which is 3 years.
Which is about 3 years. And so far as we know, Your Honour, there's no evidence of other burning on the tree stump prior to Ms Barrett's activities.
And will the evidence show that Ms Barrett and Mr Robinson had been in a relationship for the whole time that she owned the property?
Again, Your Honour, I can't answer that as I stand here. They were in a relationship at the time.
It may sound like a strange question, but it does arise as a result of the matters that Mr Reid proposes to address in opening.
Yes.
I'll ask him later.
At least, Your Honour, they were in a relationship at the times that Your Honour is concerned. Now, I've mentioned the bonfires that were held on the tree stump. As I just said to Your Honour, there were also occasions where Ms Barrett and Mr Robinson had other campfires on the property. And on those other occasions, they had lit campfires away from the area of the tree stump, collecting stones to form a small circle on the ground to protect the fire, and then lighting the fire on the bare earth. Now, despite that having been done from time to time on previous occasions, the evidence will show that on the 28th of December 2012, Mr Robinson decided to light a campfire in the tree stump. Your Honour will hear evidence that Ms Barrett was concerned about lighting a fire in the stump, and that she raised those concerns with Mr Robinson. But as she later told the police, males can be hard to tell.
Well, that was the point of my question.
Yes. And in the result, Your Honour, she let it go, and she allowed Mr Robinson to build the campfire. Now, Your Honour, we say this was immediately a breach of the law. Section 69(2) of the Fire Service Act requires that a person not light a fire for cooking or warmth in or on peat or certain grasses, or within 3 metres of any stump or log or standing tree. That prohibition, in our submission, seems to be absolute. On the language of Section 69, it is not limited to the fire permit period. But even if Your Honour were to find that the prohibition is not absolute, and is limited to the fire permit period, in our submission it makes no difference here.
Well, is there any construction of section 69 which would be open to suggest that it didn't apply except in the fire permit period?
Not in our submission, Your Honour.
Oh, okay.
Even if, however, my learned friend's ingenuity was able to persuade Your Honour that there was an alternative construction available, nonetheless section 69 subsection 4 would apply. And it requires that even during a fire permit period, a campfire shall not be lit for warmth within 3 metres of any other flammable material.
Section 69?
Subsection 4.
Thank you.
Now, needless to say, Your Honour, lighting this campfire actually inside the tree stump put the fire a great deal closer to the flammable material, that is the wood of the stump, and certainly within the 3 metre requirement that would then be imposed by section 69 subsection 4. It was only a matter of centimetres from the rim of wood that formed what might be called their fire pit. Now, in short, Your Honour, we say that Mr Robinson, with Ms Barrett's acquiescence, lit a campfire in a wooden bowl.
B-O-L-E?
B-O-W-L for that purpose, Your Honour.
Right.
Now, of course, as Your Honour knows, it was also the bowl, B-O-L-E, of the tree, meaning the base of the trunk from which the roots extend. Now, Your Honour, the evidence will be that they sat by the fire for a few hours together with Mr Robinson's son. They let the campfire die down and then decided to go to bed. Your Honour will hear that Mr Robinson kicked some soil over the coals. Ms Barrett half filled 2 buckets of water from the tap beside the house porch, and she poured them over the fire as well.
So when you say go to bed, it wasn't a sleep out?
Ms Barrett apparently slept inside. Mr Robinson and his son slept in a tent in front of the house.
Right.
The son, I'm told, Your Honour, was about 10 years old at the time, and the campfire was lit for his benefit, his amusement, and he and Mr Robinson spent the night in the tent. Now, Mr Robinson subsequently told police that the next morning he checked the campfire spot. He said there was no smoke, and that he held his hand near to it and felt no heat. But we say that that was not enough, Your Honour, that he did not do the next necessary thing, which was actually to disturb the ash sitting there in what I might call the fire pit. He didn't turn it over, whether using his hand or his boot or a stick or any other implement. And our allegation, as Your Honour knows, is that the campfire, had burned down into the bowl, B-O-L-E. That is the centre of the root system of the old tree. And it then continued to burn in that low oxygen subterranean environment as what is called an underground smouldering burn. Your Honour will hear evidence that smouldering burns in tree stumps and root systems and peat are all well recognised phenomena. We say that they actually explain the enactment of section 69 of the Fire Service Act that I mentioned earlier, in particular subsection 2. Now, I've referred to that provision a couple of times, Your Honour. Could we bring it up, please? The version as in force in December 2012 is document 125 leg.001.001.0002. And if we could go down to section 61 and pause there. Your Honour sees the provision for the declaration of fire permit periods. And in section 61, subsection 4, public notice means a notice published in a daily newspaper, and Your Honour has already seen the declaration from the Hobart Mercury. Could we now go down, further down this document to section 69? And pause there so that we can see the whole. Thank you. Could I draw Your Honour's attention to subsection 1 initially, and in particular subsection 1A. And then, Your Honour, we rely chiefly on section 69.2. I said a moment ago, Your Honour, in our submission, that prohibition is absolute, even if there is some alternative construction, which with respect we say there is not. Can I draw Your Honour's attention to section 69, subsection 4, which on any view must apply to the situation that existed on the 28th of December, even if the prohibition is not absolute. Now, Your Honour will notice, for instance, in subsection 69.2, paragraph A, the reference to peat, for example. In our respectful submission, really everyone knows that you don't light fires in peat because they are notorious for turning into long-running, smouldering burns. And the same reason explains the Act's prohibition on lighting fires in tree stumps as well as logs and trees. That is, the fires can continue out of sight and hard to detect for a long time after they appear to be out. But can I return to the story? The campfire was on the 28th of December. Mr Robinson and his son stayed overnight, and then they left the property later in the day on the 29th of December, while Ms Barrett stayed. Now, New Year's Eve came and went. On the 1st of January 2013, there was some light rain. The rainfall data is recorded back in document 72 that Your Honour saw a moment ago. I don't need it to be brought up again. It was, in fact, only a couple of millimetres worth of rain. Now, there is some importance to this that Your Honour will have seen from the statement of claim in the proceeding. That is, Your Honour will hear that Ms Barrett later told the Tasmanian Fire Service investigators that after that rain, she had noticed steam rising from the ground near the stump. She puts it on or about the 1st of January. Now, importantly, Your Honour, this was not steam from the ground generally, from the property overall. It was just from the stump or from the area very near to the stump. And Your Honour will also hear that Ms Barrett told the police and TFS investigators that she had had trouble putting out fires in the stump in the past when she'd done burning off in the winter months. She told the investigators that the stump stayed warm for a couple of days and she would keep going over to put more water on it. But in response to seeing the steam on the 1st of January 2013, Your Honour, she did nothing. She did not go over to kick over the coals or dig around to find the source of the heat that was turning rainwater to steam. She did nothing. There was another sprinkling of rain on the 2nd of January, and Your Honour may need to hear evidence about that day too.
Another
sprinkling of rain on the 2nd of January. Right. So, between the 28th and the 2nd of January, the weather had been cool. There had been a couple of dustings of rain. But then we get to the 3rd of January. As I said at the outset, and as Your Honour well knows, Tasmania in early January has weather that can change quickly. And Thursday the 3rd was a return to hot, dry, windy weather. The 3rd of January, responding to a point that Your Honour raised with me a moment ago, was a day of total fire ban. The declaration is in the court book at document 74, doc.001.001.0098. And relevantly, Your Honour sees that the declaration of total fire ban commenced at midnight. Now it's expressed slightly awkwardly, but it's accepted, as we understand it, that midnight on Thursday, 3 January, means effectively 12:01 a.m, and it continues until 12:01 a.m. the next day. But the 3rd of January itself was the day of total fire ban. Now, during the morning...
Can we just have a look at the rest of that document?
Certainly are.
Okay, so it has no application to fires already burning.
Correct, John.
Which is rather odd, isn't it, when you think about it?
Although I'm no
Don't let me distract you. I'm
I
just musing, but
I think, Your Honour, I may have acquiesced a little bit too quickly there. In relation to the fire permits, Your Honour will see under about halfway down the page the heading Fire Permits and item C that the occupier of land where a fire occurs during this declaration shall immediately take diligent steps to extinguish it. So if there was a fire already burning, it's hard to imagine
that the word occurs wouldn't cover it.
Well, Your Honour, we would say that it is a little hard to see how somebody could have been, for instance, conducting burning off operations the day before. But if they had been, then we would say they had to stop it and put the fire out by the time this declaration came into force.
To take diligent steps.
Yes.
Yep. Thank you.
Now, during the morning of Thursday the 3rd, Ms Barrett was visited by a horse farrier, Mr Wrigley, who she'd hired to reshoe her horse. Your Honour will hear that Mr Wrigley, when he arrived at the property, drove straight to the horse enclosure, the paddock, in front of the house and down the hill. He worked down there, then drove up to the house to collect his pay. He never went near the area around the tree stump. He was a smoker, but Your Honour will hear that he was fastidious about keeping his cigarette butts and not discarding them. His practice was to drop them into an empty water bottle or soft drink can, or even put them into his jeans rather than throw them on the ground. Indeed, when the police investigators checked on him in the evening of the 3rd of January, he still had the cigarette butts in his pocket. But most importantly, his evidence is that he never went near the area where the fire started. So him being a smoker or even being at the property in our submission is irrelevant. In the result, Ms Barrett paid Wrigley and he drove away off the property. She went inside to get a coffee and decide how to spend the balance of her day. Mr Robinson and his son and one of the son's friends were at Park Beach surfing that day and had invited her to join them, and so that was one of her options. But it was too hot and too windy, and so she was thinking about just spending the afternoon doing some housework. Your Honour will watch a video this afternoon, the recording of the police interview with Ms Barrett at the property 2 days later, on Saturday the 5th of January. She said that after Mr Wrigley left, she started to make her coffee and potted about inside for just a few minutes, then came back out onto that front deck that Your Honour saw just to the north of the property, that is on the north face of the residence, in the earlier photographs. Ms Barrett says that she looked across to her right, that is to the east, and saw a low wall of pale flames just on the far side of the tree stump. The wall was a few metres long and on both sides of the driveway, viewed from where she stood. Could we bring up document 101 again and go to the first photograph? This shows the general view from about the area of the deck. And Your Honour sees there to the left of the photograph what's called the flat driveway. And Ms Barrett says that she saw flames on either side of the flat driveway.
At what time was this?
This was shortly before 2:15, Your Honour.
Thank you.
Sometime between about 2 o'clock and certainly before 2:15. Now, what Ms Barrett describes to the police is important, because what she describes is a fire, and in fact these are the words that she uses, is a fire that was already established by the time she saw it. She didn't actually see it start. It was already 5 to 10 metres wide. And there was some fire backing into the wind and creeping toward her, but mainly it was running away from her, pushed east by a westerly wind. Later, with the police, Ms Barrett marked with pink spray paint some lines to indicate where the wall of flames was when she first saw it. Could we go in this bundle to photograph number 10, please? Now the line at the bottom of the screen, the spray painted line, is the first one that Ms Barrett drew. It was quite close to the east side of the tree stump. Later she had second thoughts and marked a second line, which is the one on the far side of the green arrow. Now, our submission ultimately will be, Your Honour, that the precise position of the pink lines doesn't matter, for two reasons. Firstly, given the oblique angle from which Ms Barrett saw the flames, the lines could only ever be approximations. But second, and most importantly, what she first saw was not the first minute or two of the fire. It was established by the time she saw it as a grass fire that was running east under the influence of a wind that she described to police as being gale force, or like a freight train. Ms Barrett says she ran inside. She called 000 and reported the fire. Your Honour will receive in due course the the evidence of the 000 call.
Does the time of the 000 call spring to your mind immediately? Don't trouble yourself if it doesn't.
It doesn't, Your Honour.
Okay.
I think it was a little after 2:15, and it was not the first 000 call.
Which was about 14:32.
2:14:32. I'm told it was 2:14, Your Honour.
2:14.
And the first call in relation to this fire, I think, was at 2:12, 2:13.
Thank you.
After making the call, Ms Barrett ran back outside to get a bucket and a watering can, and she tried to ring Mr Robinson down at the beach. She filled the bucket and the can from the tap in front of the house because the hose would not reach all the way to all of the areas that she could see were on fire. Ms Barrett then ran back and forth between the fire and the tap. She called 000 again, although the evidence will show that by that time the Dodgers Ferry volunteer brigade had already been mustered and was on its way. Ms Barrett also got hold of Mr Robinson down at the beach. He called in the two boys from the surf and they headed up to the property as well. But for the first 20 or 30 minutes, Ms Barrett was on her own. As I've said, the wind was strong. She describes it as coming like a freight train. The fire spread quickly into those trees that you want to see at the top of the photograph to the east of the tree stump, and it spread in the classic V-shaped pattern of a rapidly growing fire under the influence of a strong wind. As the fire hit the trees, Your Honour sees that the land slopes down slightly, but then Your Honour can probably make out through the trees that after the low saddle, the land starts to rise up towards the property at 244 White Hills Road. The fire also spread towards the southeast down into the gully that I pointed out to Your Honour in relation to one of the earlier photographs. And that, Your Honour, was the start of the Fawcett bushfire.
Is the photograph that's up at the moment, the yellow arrow, is that to signify the direction of the fire?
Yes, as we understand it, Your Honour.
And the wind was?
The wind was coming from effectively behind the photographer.
Right.
The wind was a strong westerly.
Yes.
And therefore driving the fire towards the east.
So we're looking east?
This photograph is looking roughly east, Your Honour.
Yes, thank you.
Now, over the next couple of hours, the fire ran through the gully that was slightly down this hill and to the right. It headed towards properties on Inala Road. Your Honour is going on a formal view tomorrow morning to assist Your Honour to get some better appreciation of the topography of this landscape. And then after that, when we move to the witnesses, Your Honour will hear from the witnesses who were located along Inala Road that they could see smoke to their west and northwest. They could not see Ms Barrett's property because there was a hill in the way, but the smoke was coming straight over them. Now, for the first few hundred metres as the fire left the Barrett property, It skirted around the southwest perimeter of an area that had been burned in a small wildfire back in October 2012. Because of the reduced fuel in that area, it acted as a bit of a fire break. Nevertheless, the fire spread along the edge of that old scar, and as it moved to the southern end of that old scar, the westerly wind drove it hard to the east, mainly to the north of Inala Road. What the properties there confronted was more of a flanking fire, the southern end of an east-running fire, rather than confronting the main front. Your Honour will hear evidence that the terrain was treacherous. The fire service ground crews could not get in to the main gully, nor could they fight on the steep slopes of the hill line to the north of Inala Road. Your Honour will hear that helicopters were dropping water, but water bombing only suppresses a bushfire. You need ground crews to extinguish it. The fire ran east into the evening. Weather conditions eased, but still it reached the hill, sometimes called Mother Brown's Bonnet and sometimes called Red Hill. Fire always burns more quickly going up a hill, and this fire was up and over the hill by the morning of Friday the 4th of January. There was no safe way to fight the fire overnight. Weather conditions might have eased, but the terrain was impossible. And during the Friday, at about lunchtime, the weather turned. The day was again hot and dry and windy, but worst of all, the wind direction changed. It was now from the north or northwest. And as Your Honour will know, a wind change is the phenomenon most characteristic of the very worst bushfires in southeastern Australia. It was the defining characteristic of the 1983 Ash Wednesday fires in Victoria and South Australia, and it was the defining characteristic of the 2009 Black Saturday fires in Victoria, and it was also the case with this fire. And the reason for that is that the strong westerly wind on Thursday had pushed the fire in essentially a long, narrow strip towards the east. It was a fire with long flanks and a relatively narrow front. But when the wind changed, the southern flank became the new front. That new front now raced towards the south. It jumped the Arthur Highway and it rolled inexorably down toward Dunalley. Your Honour will hear from one of the plaintiffs, Ms Sonia Daly, how the Dunalley residents sheltered on the beach. Indeed, they spent hours in the water with cloths over their faces trying to breathe. Even in water up to her chest, Ms Daly,
of course, is the test plaintiff.
She's the test case plaintiff.
Correctly, I think she's the only plaintiff in this action, in this trial.
She's the only plaintiff whose individual claim is being determined in this trial, Your Honour. Your Honour's findings in respect of the common questions, that is, whether the fire was caused as a result of negligence or nuisance, and whether it was that fire that became the Fawcett bushfire, are findings that will be binding on the defendant in respect of all of the other plaintiffs, but they are not being called to give evidence as to their
No, I understand that,
responses.
but I mean, strictly, there is only one plaintiff on this trial. The fact that any findings I make in respect of that plaintiff bind the parties in respect of other plaintiffs who commenced proceedings is a separate thing.
I think, Your Honour, well, I need to check this, Your Honour, but I think Your Honour had made an order that what I'll call the common questions would be dealt with effectively as separate questions, but still in the claims of those other plaintiffs. That's the only reason that I hesitate to adopt Your Honour's formulation.
Okay.
We would say that those other plaintiffs' issues, so far as they are the common questions, are formally before Your Honour.
So, for the purposes of submissions, purposes of judgment writing, we should be referring to the plaintiffs?
Yes.
Where necessary, identifying one plaintiff as the test case plaintiff?
Yes. Yes. Now, it may be, for instance, Your Honour, that as the evidence progresses, Your Honour concludes that it's not possible to make a finding, for instance, about causation in respect of plaintiffs from one geographic area rather than another. We, for our part, do not think that that's likely to be a problem that will concern Your Honour. I simply mention it for completeness. Really, once this fire was underway, in our submission it was unstoppable, and it was that fire that impacted all of the plaintiffs.
And while we're on this, all of this is dealt with in the order that I made in September, was it 19 September 2019?
Yes, I was about to say not last year, I think it was the year before, Your Honour. Yes. Now, as I was saying, Your Honour will hear evidence from Ms Sonia Daly. I was about to say that Your Honour will hear that Ms Daly and her family sheltered in the water off the beach at Dunalley for up to 3 hours with cloths over their face, trying to breathe despite the smoke and the fire that had swept through the town. Even in water up to her chest, Ms Daly was knocked over by the force of the convection winds created by the fire's own microclimate. Now that was just on the evening of Friday the 4th of January, Your Honour. Ultimately the fire burned for nearly 3 weeks. Your Honour will hear evidence as to the final reach of the fire, that is its footprint or fire area, from Mr Marsden Smedley, one of the experts called, the expert called by the plaintiffs. Mr Marsden Smedley undertook work for the Tasmanian Commission of Inquiry into the aftermath of the 2013 fires that reported itself in 2013. In due course, we'll be tendering Mr Marsden's various reports. For present purposes regarding the course of the Fawcett fire, I'll simply mention for the transcript that it's dealt with in Mr Marsden's report to the Tasmanian Fire Inquiry in 2013, which is document 89 in the court bundle, and refer Your Honour in particular to pages 16 and again at page 48. I don't need the operator to bring it up. Now, can I turn, Your Honour, to the question of the cause of the fire and deal in slightly more minute detail with the allegations as to how this bushfire started. That is, how a campfire reignited after more than 6 days. I'll mention the evidence that Your Honour will hear about the suspicions that arose on the day of the fire, and then how those suspicions were confirmed in the formal investigation that started a couple of days later. Can I start with the day of the fire itself? I've explained how Ms Barrett called the fire service while trying to fight the early stages of the fire. The first unit on the scene was the volunteer brigade from Dodgers Ferry. Your Honour will hear evidence from the members of the crew who were in the truck, Mr Terenius, Mr Sward and Mr Hawke. Your Honour will hear how Ms Barrett approached them as they came up the track or driveway towards her house. She was panicked, and her first concern was for her neighbour's property. But Your Honour will hear as well that Ms Barrett immediately told the volunteer firefighters that the fire had come from the stump. The Dodgers Ferry truck then went to protect the neighbour's property at 244 Whitehills Road, since it was now in the direct path of the fire. Soon afterward, a volunteer crew from Midway Point also arrived and went straight to 244 Whitehills Road. Mr Robinson then got to the scene, that is Ms Barrett's property, at 242 Whitehills Road. He still had the 2 boys with him. Ms Barrett put them to work, helping her fill the buckets and throw them on the fire that was still backing towards her place and continued in various spots around her property. Then, Your Honour, a 3rd fire brigade arrived, this time from 7 Mile. When they arrived, Mr Robinson left. He was concerned about having someone else's child with him, and so he went to take that child home and to collect his own firefighting gear. Your Honour will hear that by the time the 7 Mile crew arrived, helicopters were attacking the fire in the gully below and to the east of Ms Barrett's house. The 7 Mile crew, because the helicopters were already on scene, were stationed at Ms Barrett's house in case the fire backburned into the wind and started to threaten her property again. But at the time they arrived, there was no fire threat immediately confronting the residents at 242 White Hills Road. So there was a chance to draw breath. And that pause is important because Your Honour will hear how Mr Anthony Butler from the 7 Mile Brigade spoke with Ms Barrett. He took the opportunity to ask her what had happened, and they walked around the area where she had first seen the fire. Your Honour will hear how Ms Barrett told Mr Butler about the farrier having been on the property earlier in the day. But Your Honour will also hear how Mr Butler then examined the tree stump and saw a blackened, smoking, still burning root immediately adjacent to the main rim of wood. Mr Butler will give evidence that he immediately challenged Ms Barrett and pointed out the root to her and asked her about it. And she told him, like she had mentioned to the Dodgers ferry crew, about the campfire a few days earlier and how Robinson had lit the fire despite her concerns. So those were the things that Ms Barrett said on the day of the fire itself. The fire remained a threat even in the White Hills Road area for the next few days. Indeed, Your Honour will hear that it backburned west back along the gully, and a later wind change actually drove it back up to Ms Barrett's own house again. And it was after those further dramas that the police and the Tasmanian Fire Service fire scene investigators attended the property on Saturday the 5th of January. The evidence will show that there was an initial suspicion that someone perhaps had been burning off on the property despite the fire ban, and that the burning off had been done behind the house, that is, on the south or southeast side of the house, near an area where the septic tank had been installed. When Your Honour watches the police videos this afternoon, Your Honour will see that this notion that perhaps there'd been some burning off in the area of the septic tank features in the initial police interviews of Ms Barrett and Mr Robinson. But Your Honour, that suspicion did not last long.
Sorry, which side of the house is the septic tank on, did you say?
The septic tank is towards the south, is on the southeast corner of the house.
The southeast corner of the house.
Some 20 or 30 metres slightly down the hill.
Okay.
Now that suspicion about the fire having started in that area and reflecting some illegal burning off on the day did not last. That's because when the fire service investigators continued their investigation the next day and subsequently, they were able to work out very reliably what had happened. Now, Your Honour may be familiar with the forensic techniques that are used to investigate structural fires in buildings. There are related but different techniques for wildfire investigations. Your Honour will hear about the physical signs that mark the early stages of a bushfire. The first minutes of any fire are low intensity, and the combination of wind and a low intensity flame means that not everything is incinerated. Grass is scorched rather than incinerated, and the scorching effect is called freeze. That is, the grass freezes in the direction it was being blown by the wind when the fire passed over it. And the result is that the line of the grass from its tip back to its base is like an arrow pointing toward the ignition site. Similar things happen
Pointing towards the ignition site?
Yes, Your Honour. If the fire will tend to blow the grass down. I'll withdraw that. The wind will tend to blow the grass down. The fire will sweep across the grass, scorching it. The grass then freezes in that blown down position. The tip of the grass, obviously, that was normally sitting proud of the ground, will have been blown in the direction of the wind. The tip running back to the root indicates the direction that the fire had come from. Similar things happen with the thin branches on bushes and trees. Can I give Your Honour an example of this? It's in document 101 again, and could we go to photograph 26?
I'm sorry to be pedantic, but I need to understand this. The tip, in fact, the tip of the grass would show the direction in which the fire was going. Going back from the tip to the base would indicate the direction from which the fire came.
Yes, yes. If I muddied that, Your Honour, I apologise. That was the point I was trying to make. Are we having trouble with...
Which document is it?
Document 101, Your Honour. It's the bundle of photographs. Again. There we go. And it was photograph 26, please. And it's a little hard to make out, Your Honour, but the small saplings that are in the foreground of the photograph, in the middle of the foreground, Your Honour sees a white arrow. It's actually a wooden or plastic object that's been placed on the ground by the fire scene investigators. But if Your Honour can make out the position of the branches and twigs on those saplings, Your Honour can see again that they've been blown by the wind and then frozen by the scorching effect of the low intensity fire. And then, Your Honour, as the fire gains intensity and hits trees, the wind blows the flame around the trunk toward its downwind side. The result is that the tree will burn higher on the downwind side than on the upwind side. And so that burn pattern again indicates the direction of the wind and therefore the direction from which the fire came. And there's an example of this in the same bundle at photograph 13. And Your Honour sees there a eucalypt, and the blackened scarring is much higher on the side that indicates the direction in which the fire was travelling, rather than on the other side. And the reason for that, as I said, is that the wind blows the flames around towards the back of the tree, the downwind side of the tree. It's then slightly protected and burns further up the tree. Now, Mr. Walkley and Mr.
So the
Bones,
downwind side of the tree burns further up the tree?
Yes.
Because it's protected?
Yes.
Yes, I see.
Now, that's the phenomenon that applies for a low intensity fire. Obviously, by the time the fire has become a true inferno, trees will be burned completely. But when you're dealing with the early stages of a bushfire, it will be a low intensity fire, and Your Honour will hear evidence from the two Tasmanian Fire Service fire scene investigators, Mr. Walkley and Mr. Bones. I'll explain to Your Honour in more detail these phenomena, which are called the fire language. Now, as Your Honour can then imagine, the bushfire investigators can then look at this fire language and work backwards. For instance, the photo that Your Honour sees on screen, one can immediately tell that the fire was coming from the right-hand side of the screen, not the left-hand side. The investigators start with the big signs, these burn patterns on trees, for instance, and then work against the direction of fire travel back towards the source of the fire, moving from big signs like trees to the smaller signs like saplings and bushes, and ultimately looking for the very small indicators on the ground that indicate the first small flames of a growing fire. Now, then things get a little complicated, because fire does not just burn downwind. When it does, it's called a running fire. Provided there is sufficient fuel, even in a strong wind, fire will also burn upwind, that is, a backing fire. And it will burn sideways as well, called a flanking fire. But because of the effects of the wind, the backing and flanking fire will spread much more slowly than the running fire. Still,
Say that again, please.
because of the effects of the wind, backing fire and flanking fire will spread much more slowly than the fire running with the wind.
Yes, thank you. I understand.
Nevertheless, as you work backwards against the signs of running fire, one reaches an area where the signs of running fire start to blend with the indicators of backing and flanking fire. In wildfire investigations, that area of mixed signals is called the area of confusion. In a structural fire, for instance a building, it's called the area of origin, but it means the same location where the signs of the direction of fire travel are ambiguous or confused. Now, Your Honour will hear evidence that the fire service investigators here, Mr Bones and also Mr Johnson in the first instance, walked the whole area around the Barrett property looking at the fire language, and they identified an area of confusion that covered the area from the tree stump across to the tree line to the east and south of the stump. That was their preliminary assessment on the 5th of January. Two things happened in the evening of the 5th of January. The first was that Mr Bones, the fire investigator, called for assistance, and one of the Tasmanian Fire Service's most experienced wildfire investigators was brought in. That's Mr Walkley. Now, secondly, on the afternoon and evening of the 5th of January, the police conducted their first interviews with Ms Barrett and Mr Robinson, and Your Honour will hear and see the interviews this afternoon. Ms Barrett made very clear to the police that she was 100% certain that the fire had come from the tree stump, and she was visibly shocked at the suggestion from the police that there might have been burning off in the area of the septic tank. So that was the 5th of January. On the 6th of January, Mr Bones and Mr Johnson, the initial fire service investigators, but now also Mr Walkley, repeated the process of following the macro fire language to reconfirm the area of confusion near Ms Barrett's residence. What then happened was that Mr Bones spent some time assisting the police with other investigations they were making, while Mr Walkley and Mr Johnson conducted a minute examination within the area of confusion. They confirmed that the area of confusion was that space covering the tree stump and extending south and to the east to the tree line. Your Honour will hear how Mr Walkley then approached Ms Barrett to ask whether she had lit any fire within that area in the preceding days. And Ms Barrett again mentioned to him the campfire. Your Honour will hear how Mr Walkley and Mr Johnson then examined the area around the tree stump. The grass and vegetable debris was singed, but there had only been sparse grass, and the fire had been moving quickly under the influence of the wind. Your Honour will hear how Mr Walkley found a piece of charcoal peeking through the surface. It stood out, being dark charcoal against the grey and sandy-coloured dirt and other debris. Your Honour will hear about the investigation that Mr Walkley and Mr Johnson then undertook, digging around that charcoal. They determined it to be a root, and they dug along the line of charcoal, along the line of the root, in the direction of the tree stump.
Is this the perpendicular route referred to in the...
Our friends refer to it as perpendicular.
Sorry?
Our friends refer to it as perpendicular.
Yes.
Yes, Your Honour. Now, the evidence will be that in fact the route was snaking. It was not a straight line route, it moved back and forth. Mr. Walkley and Mr. Johnson excavated along that line of the route. They were able to follow the path of the charcoal underground as they excavated around it, and it went deeper and deeper toward the stump. But the charcoal itself was almost completely powderised. The necessary process of excavating to try and follow that charcoal line unavoidably destroyed the powdered charcoal behind the direction of excavation. Your Honour will see many photos of the excavation of the tree stump. Could I just bring up one or two to show Your Honour the few lumps of solid charcoal that remained and were found by the investigators as they excavated. Could we go in this bundle to document, photograph 0050.
And I'm assuming this is where you say that fire fissured and broke through.
Yes, Your Honour.
Yes.
Now we say that the fire came out somewhere in this area. And what Your Honour sees at the bottom of the screen is a white shovel. And Your Honour will note the black, there's another of the white arrow markers at the base of the shovel and some black dots on it. And if we could also bring up photograph 52, a more close-up photograph of the shovel and the arrow, and Your Honour sees there some examples of the lumps of charcoal that had been found.
And is that the point at which they lost the trail? Is it?
That's the point at which it got too deep. Tools did not really permit further excavation. If we can go back to the previous photo, please, to 050. It's a little hard to make out with the just because of the limitations of a photograph, Your Honour, but if Your Honour looks to the point of the arrow there, that's at the base of the shovel, if we could perhaps enlarge the photograph to see that, the whole of the shovel. There we go. Now what Your Honour might be able to discern there is that you've got sort of pale clay further down in the hole.
Obviously a steep drop in the course of the excavation.
That's right. Your Honour can just make out from, for instance, the sort of brown staining running down from the rocks at the top left-hand side of the screen, that they've had to dig some 50 centimetres or more down to that level. And Your Honour will also notice, and our friends, experts seem to place great store by this, that there are other routes very close to this line of charcoal which are not burnt. Now, Your Honour, the evidence will be that a mature eucalypt will send out roots at different depths. Many of them will spread laterally, but they all tend to rise toward the surface looking for moisture. So it's not unusual that the excavators here, following the route, needed to dig deeper and deeper as they got closer to the trunk. Ultimately, it was getting too deep. The soil becomes clay. To try and excavate any further would require machinery. The machinery is unlikely to be able to be applied with sufficient dexterity to avoid destroying the evidence more than exposing it. In the result, Mr. Walkley and Mr. Johnson, and then when they examined the excavation with Mr. Bones, all concluded that the last vestiges of coal that Your Honour sees in the photograph there, within now a couple of metres of the tree stump, were connected to the tree stump. Mr. Bones then wrote the TFS report. Your Honour will hear that Mr. Walkley concurs in its findings, and the findings were that the campfire that had been lit in the tree stump on the 28th of December had burned down into the root system. It smouldered underground until one of the burning roots reached the surface. At that point, oxygen became freely available. The smouldering burn became a free burn, perhaps a flame, but perhaps just glowing red coal that let off embers, a technical term for what we might call sparks. The flame, or a spark, ignited the dry grass at the surface and started the bushfire. Now, can I turn briefly to some of the defendants' theories as to the ignition of the fire?
Well, it might be a good time to break, because I had proposed that each day we take a break at 11:15.
Thank you.
And as I understand it, with the delayed webcast will be implemented during the course of that break. So the first session of the morning will be online, and so for each subsequent session.
Thank you.
And we sit till 1:45 or thereabouts, and adjourn for lunch, and then resume at 2:15, subject to any witnesses being in the middle.
Sorry, 1:45, Your Honour?
At 12:45.
Thank you.
And resume at 2:15.
Thank you.
And 4 o'clock, again, subject to any witness being in the middle of some critical examination.
Okay. I think I've got, just for my own friend's information, 15 or 20 minutes left.
Right, okay. All right, well, we'll take a break until 11:30. Court will adjourn.
This concludes this honourable court now stands adjourned until 11:30.